thanking Anna for those very kind words, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Raquel and Esther and the rest of the organizing committee for the invitation to participate. We were honored and indeed we're delighted to be here. Thank you very much. So as you see, we're going to be talking about a data-driven approach to language mixing. And this is one way to consider it, right? So we know that when languages are in contact, there is going to be some level of mixing. The question comes to how much mixing there is and in what ways we might be able to measure it. When we study language mixing, typically we have these three perspectives. We look at borrowing, of course. Barbara and I are especially interested in code switching, and we'll be using code switching and mixing interchangeably in this presentation. We're also interested in convergence, which we conceptualize now as covert code switching. That is, there is the presence of two languages, but it's not overtly manifested. With our research, we have goals that you see here, that is to develop means for quantifying and visualizing and sharing data. And in particular, we're talking about language contact data. This is important for us because it would afford us, and all of you, the ability to compare corpora in ways that are replicable and therefore more robust, so that even small data sets can be profitably exploited, right, to bring us big findings. For the presentation today, we're going to divide our talk into two parts. I'll begin and then Barbara will take up. First, we're going to discuss how it is that we come to quantify and visualize so that we can model corpora for comparisons. And then we'll move on to applying these methods and metrics to test some theoretical proposals regarding language mixing. Here's a good example of language mixing. In the first example, for some reason I'm starting to talk Spanglish, like I'll start off talking American, después mi mexicana quiere salir. That's a great example from Twitter, and you can see the presence of Spanish and English. In the second example, this is a lovely example, it was shared with us by a colleague who directed a Hindi program at the University of Texas. The program was called Hindi Lives Here, or Hindi Lives Here. And after seeing this amount of switching, he abandoned the project and called it Hindi Dies Here, because there is, as you can see, so much English present there. But this is precisely the type of data that we're interested in. When we look at language mixing from the perspective of linguistics, we know that it is very well studied and across multiple subfields, as we've heard at this conference. What we find, however, is that examples are often handpicked, right, cherry-picked, and decontextualized. The data is not necessarily representative, right, because it's sporadically sampled. We know very little oftentimes about the frequency and the distribution of these mixed forms. And finally, and very importantly, very seldom do we have metadata on the speakers or the communities in which they reside. Okay, all very important factors for understanding mixing. In turn, if we look at corpus studies of language mixing, we find that these are based on more ecologically valid data. But again, the data here is subject to individual annotation schemes, right? So individual authors will annotate their data in different ways. And for this reason, they're oftentimes very small data sets, right? Because again, oftentimes this is done manually. And then finally, the data, because it is so labor intensive to collect and to annotate, is oftentimes inaccessible. Right, so authors will have a tendency to want to hold tightly to their data and not make it accessible. And finally, in natural language processing studies of language mixing, you find that researchers can sample a wide variety of languages, but again, here we see some limitations. So in NLP, Twitter seems to be the corpus of choice, right? There's ample data, easily accessible, but also the aims of NLP research are monolingual. Okay, so they're very much interested in rapid and accurate processing of monolingual data sets. In fact, we've learned from colleagues in industry that when mixed data is encountered, it is excluded. The consequences here is that for linguistic studies, we tend to, or we have a tendency to under or overestimate the amount of mixing, right? Which leads to a mischaracterization of mixing patterns for individuals, for communities, for particular language pairings and typologies. In corpus studies, there's this paucity of accessible data over which generalizations can be made. Okay, again, many of these data sets that are collected are privately held. And then finally, for NLP studies, here we're neglecting a major aspect of communication, which is bilingual communication, right, where you alternate freely between your languages. So the motivations for our projects really are to respond to these desiderata for the study of language mixing. First, we need ample data, and we're going to show you how you can collect ample data and exploit even small data sets. We need tools for annotating large data sets, right? These are data sets that are larger than what linguists often work with. And then finally, a platform for openness and sharing. Those are the goals of our work. Let's start with the automatic annotation. There are many benefits. The first, obviously, is that it diminishes some of the obstacles to working with natural data. Okay, all of you collect data, and then you need to transcribe and annotate, and it'd be wonderful to be able to do that automatically. It eliminates some of the errors that are, in fact, introduced by manual coding. As a simple example from code switching, whether a word is a code switch or a borrowing is not something that you should decide at the level of coding, right? It's something that should emerge from the data. It increases accountability through replicability. Okay? If data sets are automatically annotated, someone else should come along and be able to have the very same annotation that you have. And it encourages collaboration and open data. And finally, because of all this, it would accelerate the production of findings for the study of mixing. With additional benefits here for quantification and visualization, if we are able to quantify mixing and visualize mixing, then we can glean information that can help us to inform or to generate proposals about language mixing. Okay, we can generate those proposals simply by looking at quantification and visualization. This in turn allows for corpora to be more easily compared. And when we visualize, we can see what types of hypotheses are really worth testing. Finally, these results really can inform the development of new tools and techniques. If you think, for instance, about the way that your phone works with predictability, if we're able to inform Google about the fact that you don't typically get switching between an auxiliary and a verb, right? That's important information for developers as well. So today we're going to show you how we quantify and visualize code switching or code mixing. We're going to talk about metrics that are based on data that is tagged for language, and I'll talk about that momentarily. We'll talk about the distribution of monolingual spans, right? If you think of a mixed language text as a series of spans in one language and then in another language. And then we'll illustrate this approach in modeling code switching and testing some hypotheses. Okay, quantification and visualization. Let's start here. First and foremost, I need to stress that all of our metrics are based on word-level language annotation. What that means is that every word in a data set is tagged for a language. This word is Spanish, this word is English. We have a system to automatically annotate our text, and it operates with about 98% accuracy, which is wonderful when you stop to consider how very similar Spanish and English can be with respect to orthography. A simple word like sail or sale, right? Is it a noun or is it a verb? Or is it a determiner in English or is it a preposition in Spanish? Okay, so again, word level language annotation is the basis for the metrics that we'll be discussing. The metrics are of two types. One type has to do with ratio, right? So the relative presence of one language or another, and I'll explain each one. So the M-index and then the probability of switching, how integrated the languages are. And then we also have time course measures, that is, throughout a text, how are the languages distributed? Okay, how is the switching distributed throughout a text? Let's start with the M-index. This multilingual index is from Barnett et al. We've borrowed it from them. This merely quantifies the proportion of languages represented in a text, right? So, for instance, you might have a text that is 50% Spanish, 50% English. That sounds interesting, right? However, it might be all English and then a translation in Spanish. Okay, so that is not the type of mixed text that we'd be interested in. Okay, so the M-index gives you just a proportion of languages represented. So we have also the integration index, and this will tell you the probability of switching between languages. We didn't put up the math formulas, but if anybody's interested, you can speak with us afterwards. But this particular metric is bound between 0 and 1. 0 if a corpus is fully monolingual. As you get closer to 1, then you have every word that's in a different language, right? So we don't expect to have necessarily a 1, right? Okay. Excuse me. So these indices, the M-index and the I-index, don't yet provide a complete picture, right? So knowing that you have a relative proportion of languages or how often you might switch, that is not enough. We also need to look at the sequencing of words in a text. And it's important in this regard to think of switching as inducing language spans. So let's take a look at this example here. You have, anyway, al taxista, right away le noté un acentito not too specific. Okay? Very nice. Compare that, gracias Raquel. Compare that with the second example. Sí, y lo otro no lo es, scratch the knob and I'll kill you. You can see that you have very different types of language spans in them. Okay? All right, you can visualize this here, and this is, let me see if I can use the pointer. No, you can see it? No. Okay, well, that's okay. What you see at the top here for the first sentence, the animal taxista, you can see that you have the English word, and then you move up to a Spanish span, right, for 2 words, and then you come back to an English span for 2 words. Okay, so here you can see the language identification and the different spans that the switches induce. Whereas for the second sentence, you have only 2 spans, right? There's only a single switch. So for this, we can look at the time course. Burstiness is actually fairly simple to explain. It tells us really how regular, how periodic switching is. Okay, so how periodic or aperiodic switching is. If it's bursty, you've got long monolingual spans, and then you have a burst of another language. Okay, all right. And finally, memory is the last metric that I'll talk about. Memory relates to the autocorrelation of spans, sequences of spans. So do you always have long spans of one language followed by short spans of the other language? Or is it, sometimes long, sometimes short? So this, again, is a measure called memory that comes out of natural systems. Some of you might recognize it. All right, so let's look at these metrics in action. Okay, there are these theoretical proposals that we might want to test. First, typologies of switching. Here we're referencing the work of Peter Meisken, who talks about insertion, alternation, congruent lexicalization, which we won't talk about congruent lexicalization. We've got the matrix language hypothesis of Carol Meyer-Scotten, which we'll also look at. And then we'll look at some syntactic constraints, including the functional head constraint, which I co-authored with Balazzi and Rubin when I was a graduate student, and Jeff McSwan's null theory of code switching. On the typologies of code switching, we know that the degree, or scholars in the field have suggested that the degree of mixing is predicated on any number of factors, including the intensity and the length of contact, the degree of bilingualism of the speakers, the structures of the languages involved, the social context in which the speakers find themselves, and these factors have been very well examined, but this also is the type of data that is valuable in studying language mixing. The data sets that we're going to start with include these listed here. The first one, Killer Crónicas, is about 40,000 words. The second, Yo-Yo Boing, about 58,000. Again, you can see that these aren't exceedingly large data sets, right? They're not the billions of words that computational linguists normally work with. Nevertheless, we're able to gain quite a lot of information and then to concatenate these data sets and gain even more. We have some spoken speech transcripts, and let me show you each of them. So this first one, Killer Crónicas, is a book that I like very much. It is fully written in mixed speech. The author herself, Susana Chavez Silverman, describes herself as a Jewish Chicana. And when you speak with her in person, she really does speak this way. Should I read a little bit of it? No? Okay. So there you go. So different from when I lived in Spain in a secundaria. The teenager me regocijaba when my foreignness was apparent. Angry at my parents for uprooting me en la cúspide of what would be, alas, una short-lived y solo semi-popularidad, I turned upon the foreign country toda la rabia y el veneno de mi terca indiferencia. Okay. So this is the type of text that we want to work with and the type of text that we're able to annotate automatically and then to quantify the type of mixing and visualize the mixing that's done. The second is a novel. It's called Yo-Yo Boing, and this one's very interesting because it's mixed but in a very different way. So it's bookended by Spanish chapters, like fully Spanish chapters. And then in the middle, you've got quite a lot of English and then a lot of mixing as well. Okay, you've got some monolingual English and some mixing. And you can see some examples there, right? You can see that there's switches to Spanish, right? Dime la verdad at the bottom. So it's the author of this book is Puerto Rican, a New York Puerto Rican writer. So language mixing is very popular among Latinx authors these days. Turning to the oral corpora that we'll be working with, we've got the transcript of the film Bon Cop, Bad Cop. It's a Canadian film. It's fully bilingual, but interestingly, if you get the subtitles for it, the subtitles are fully in French or fully in English. So we had some of our students actually watch the film and knit together the two transcripts. It's very colloquial with respect to language. You've got a lot of French, a lot of cuss words too. French and English and franglais. I mean, they actually comment on language in the film itself. And we've looked at this film in many different ways, some of it looking at in what context French is spoken versus English is spoken, or which characters speak more French or more English, which characters code switch more, for what purpose. But it's a very nice film, and there's a part 2 if you're interested. We're also looking at the Spanish in Texas corpus. Note that it's Spanish in Texas, so the corpus is largely Spanish. But because it was collected in Texas, we also find some mixing in it. There are 97 interviews. It's available online, free and open. It's fully annotated for part of speech, etc. Fully transcribed as well. Okay, and finally, there's Solorio 7K. This is a transcript of a natural conversation among 3 bilinguals in the US. It is language tagged, and here you can see what the language tagging looks like. So the first word there you see is es, and it's a verb. In Spanish, it's a finite verb. So that is data that was shared with us by Tamar Solorio, who is a computational linguist. All right, so let's take a look at what our corpus metrics tell us. Here, what you see is that Yo-Yo Boing and Killer Crónicas, the 2 written texts, have an M index that's very high, right? So what that means is that Spanish and English are almost equally represented in those texts, right? You see the 0.95, the 0.95 and the 0.99. So again, Spanish and English are almost equally represented there. However, the mixing in them is very different, right? So the I index, this is the probability of switching in them, is highest for Killer Crónicas, which was that one that I read for you. Okay, so it's got a higher I index, whereas in Yo-Yo Boing, where you had like long spans, in fact, full chapters in Spanish and a little bit of mixing in the middle, has a very low I index. Okay, so you can see how these metrics will work. If you go further along, for burstiness, you might think of it in terms of like surprisal, right? Is code switching regular or not? And you can see in Killer Crónicas that it is not bursty, right? It's very low, okay? It's not bursty because the switching is indeed regular, whereas in Yo-Yo Boing, surprise, you're switching from one language to the other. And the same types of metrics hold for the rest. Okay, so what we can say so far is that we have a continuum of mixing. If we had to describe these texts, the written and the oral, we would say that Killer Crónicas is alternational, maybe, right? It's highly bilingual, and you've got this regular alternation of Spanish and English. Spanish in Texas and the Solorio 7, that conversation, we might say that those are insertional, because you've got mostly Spanish with some English inserted occasionally. And then other, Yo-Yo Boing and Bon Cop, Bad Cop, they are highly bilingual, right? They've got both languages very well represented, but really what you have is like long alternating monolingual spans. Okay, so again, what we have is very different profiles for these 5 data sets, and we can visualize them this way. Along the bottom, we have spans between switch points, and those are words, right? So for the blue way up top, right, that's the Killer Crónicas text. You can see that you can have a span of about 3 to 7 words, right, peak, and then you switch to the other language. Whereas for the other text, you have very long spans of one language before you switch to the other. We can also visualize it this way with a heat map. And again, what this shows is you can see in Killer Crónicas, all the colored bands, the darker bands, there's a lot of regular switching. On the bottom right, you have the Spanish in Texas, which again is largely monolingual Spanish with occasional English insertions. Okay. Now, these metrics that we've introduced are language independent, right? So they would allow us to compare any data sets as long as your data set is tagged for language. And so Barbara's going to show you how we can apply this to data that's different from the ones that I've presented so far, and then again also to test some of the theoretical proposals in the literature.
Okay, thank you. So let me see. So we're a little bit kind of scavengers. So we like getting data whenever we can get it, of code switch data. It's not easy to get, right? And so we've been working with people who work on endangered languages, because if you think about it, endangered languages, generally everybody's bilingual. And so there's a nice corpus that's been published from the Lacito group in Paris called the Pangloss Collection. Some of you might know the book from Lila Adamu on corpus linguistics. She's got aims very similar to ours. But there's different Slavic languages that are in contact with majority languages in Europe. These are small corpora. You can see the largest one there is the Molise. Oh, this isn't working. Oh, there it is. The most Molise Slavic and Italian, which is about 27,000 words. The others are small, but still, they're useful for us. So we also got some Czech English data from Mark Mislin, who published with Roger Levy a nice article on code switching in language in 2015. It's a very small corpus. It's of conversations between Czech heritage speakers in California. And it's a really interesting article. I recommend you read it. But basically, they were looking to see what the information load of code switching is. Anyway, but this is the data that Mark sent us. Notice, that's all we need. All we need is whether the token is in Czech or whether it is in English. So we've created a system which anybody can share their data with us. We only need the language tags. We don't need to know what people said. So there's no reason you can't share your data because there's no words attached to this, okay? There's no IRB necessary for you to send us language tags, for instance. And we can help you language tag your data. Just saying. Okay, and then we also have used part of the Miami corpus. We used this conversation, which is very bilingual. We call it M40, it's Maria 40. This is downloadable from TalkBank. And we used this one because it's about 8,000 words, and the Solorio 7K is also around 8,000 words, so they're the same size, more or less. So there we go. We've also got a lovely cluster of macaronic poetry. So this is medieval poetry. And it was given to us by Shime Demo. I think the whole thing, or did we just hit the labels? Whole thing. But he also sent us the language labels. His was already pre-tagged. If you know about macaronic poetry, it's basically like mock Latin, a very popular thing to do, and very mixed, as you'll see in a minute. Okay, so what we've done is we've plotted everything according to, we've measured everything according to its, how multilingual it is, the M-index, what's the probability of switching within these corpora, and then whether the switching is bursty or whether it's more regular, so bursty or regular. This can be plotted on a 3D plot. Unfortunately, I can't get it to run, but if anybody wants to see it later on, I can show you. We can spin this around live. But here at least we can see that the macaronics are in blue, so this big swath of blue are the macaronic poetry. The pink is the oral data, whether it's the endangered languages or the Spanish and Texas or what have you. And then the green are the fiction, and then there's a film. The film is orange. So the fiction and film are down here, but I can't spin this, but basically what you can see is that the macaronic is the least bursty. So macaronic poetry, the Latin is interspersed with the languages of Europe very frequently. They're also highly bilingual, whereas the oral data, the conversations are very bursty. So essentially they're monolingual with some other language insertions in them. What we want to know is whether this is the normal thing. In other words, is it the case that in fiction or poetry, there's a different constant of code switching than there is in oral conversation? And for instance, can we find different signatures of, say, Spanish-English switching or cosmopolitan Spanish-English switching versus rural or border Spanish-English switching, et cetera, et cetera. So these are things we just don't know as linguists, but we ought to know. Okay. So that's what we're working on, is this suite of measures that allows us to model code switching of any type, and that allow us to see these corpora. And this time, this plot I just showed you, they seem to be clustered differently according to different dimensions, whether one is more bursty, one is more probability of switching is higher or lower, and we can see that the constants for code switching are probably different. I mean, if you're doing fiction, you can probably mix a lot more than you might do if you were just talking. Although some of those Pangloss data, the endangered languages of Europe, those are highly mixed too, so they pattern a little bit more like the macaronics. So it's not the case that oral data can't be highly mixed, but it's probably the case that highly mixed oral data is unusual. And that's what we need to know as linguists, which we don't currently know, even though we're all bilingual and contact people here. So anyway, So let's see what else we can do with these numbers. So we want to test the matrix language. The matrix language, as you know from Myers-Scotton, says that basically there's one language that's supplying the grammar into which you're embedding words from another language. So basically it's a monolingual grammar and with some word insertions, akin sort of to borrowing. Our question is, well, okay, we had to manipulate this a little bit because we're doing this all computationally. We don't want to do things by hand. And we couldn't divide the corpus into Myers-Scotton's CP, which is her sort of like a phrasal unit, because we can't parse bilingual data. We can't give a syntactic parse yet. We're working on it. Because as soon as you switch languages, a tree tagger is not going to work anymore because they are expecting the language to be monolingual. There are no bilingual parsers. And that's not true. There is one dependency parser for Hindi English. But we're still working on bilingual parsing. So what we did is we just broke our corpora up into sentences, which was also difficult because there's no sentence tokenizers for bilingual data, which is another reason we're doing this project. So we're developing tools to work with bilingual data. But we broke them up into sentences. And what we want to find out is, do these sentences, does the different ways of measuring the language, matrix language, converge across these sentences? So we operationalize the matrix language in three ways. One is, what's the number of words in one versus the other? This is what Lila Adamu did for her analysis of the Pangloss collection. How many verbs are in one language relative to the other in a sentence, and how many functional words are in one language relative to the other. So if we take again the sentence that Jacqueline showed you before, the one that's more mixed of the two sentences that she used as an example, you can see that what you find is that in terms of word count, there's 6 words in English and 6 words in Spanish. So there's no clear matrix language with regard to word count. But there's one verb in Spanish and none in English, so according to that, Spanish would be the matrix language. And then the functional elements are a little bit split, but still there's more in Spanish than English. So they wouldn't, in other words, this wouldn't converge necessarily because one way of counting or calculating the matrix language doesn't agree with the other two. So in this case, we would have a disagree on the sentence. We can't really agree on a matrix language. Is that clear? Okay, but just think you're a machine. You're just doing this counting. That's what's going on. So the agreement is actually the dependent variable. Okay, thanks. And so what we wanted to do is find out, do you agree or you disagree on the matrix language? And so we threw all this into a regression with the metrics and the corpora as our predictor variables. So here's just the result of the regression. We like to visualize regressions and not show you numbers because we like pictures better than numbers. But what's happening here is if you've got the lower the M metric and the higher the amount of burstiness, the more the matrix language is going to converge. This just makes sense. So it's easier to find a matrix language when you've basically got an insertional type of code switching. As soon as you get more complicated, it's real hard to say. And you probably all have this experience, I suspect, if you've been ever trying to determine the matrix language. Here's just another pretty picture. These are the predictor variables. And what you see is that we've got spin text, which we know is pretty much monolingual, Spanish. So spin text, there's a lot of agreement. All of our predictor variables will show that you can easily classify a matrix language for spin text. You cannot classify a matrix language for killer chronicas that Jacqueline read to you. It's kind of impossible. But even for things like the Miami corpus and for the S7 that are primarily in one language or the other, it's still a little bit difficult to always find a single matrix language. You can see these lumps here around the 0 point, meaning there's just not enough data for them to agree on a matrix language. So we can test the matrix language this way, which I think is a valuable thing to do. I could skip that over. So am I doing fine? Yeah. Okay, so those are two where we just are using the language tags to test different proposals. That is, typologies like Moiskin and the matrix language like Myers-Scotton. So let's dig down a little bit deeper and let's imagine that we can actually get part of speech tag corpora. This would be beautiful if we could do this automatically, but we can't. So we're doing this manually with smaller data sets. So what we're going to ask is, does syntax constrain code switching? We're hoping the answer is yes, but let's just go with this. So you know the proposals that code switching is disfavored at particular syntactic junctions, following functional elements. We talked about pronouns during this conference. Switching after pronouns is not a lovely thing to do. And the question is do these constraints hold of profiles of corpora of different mixing profiles? So for instance, would the same constraints hold on Killer Chronicas that's highly mixed as S7 that's not so highly mixed? Does that make sense? Or if you're more liberal mixing, do you flaunt syntactic constraints? So we are using corpora that are part of speech tagged manually. These are the familiar ones, S7, M40, Killer Chronicas. We tag punctuation for language. So we tag it by, we give punctuation the language of the preceding token. Named entities, these are proper names. We also tag for language. We use the Stanford named entity recognizer in English and Spanish. It's kind of complicated. We'll leave that out for now. And all of our POS tag set, or part of speech tag set, is pretty stripped down because S7, well, it's pretty stripped down. We're using Google's universal part of speech tag set. Is that 5 minutes? Okay, I'll finish in 5 minutes, don't you worry. We'll get coffee. And so it's not very adequate for real linguistic research, but we're gonna go with it. This is Google's tag set, and they use it, they have similar aims to us. They're looking to universally parse the syntax of languages. The metrics are fairly much similar from what we've seen. The most mixed is Killer Chronicas, the least bursty, and the others are fairly bursty and sort of insertional. You can actually see this really easily. So this is important. So notice that black is English, red is Spanish. This is S7. Taking a look at this, you say, well, S7 is primarily in what language? This is a test. Which language is S7 primarily? English, right? So you see big, huge spans of English, sometimes spans of 300, and really tiny, short spans of Spanish. This is an insertional profile. English dominant insertion with Spanish insertions. On the other hand, the M40 conversation, which one is it dominant in? Spanish, right? So, so Spanish sometimes up to 200-300, but really short English insertions. Killer Chronicas is a nightmare. So there's Killer Chronicas, right? And what's really fun about Killer Chronicas is that it has so many more spans. There's 1,200 spans here, whereas here there were only 600, and here there were only 500, and they're all the same length. They're all about 8,000 words. So Killer Chronicas is just a nightmare to parse, right? This is the, what do we call this? The holy grail of code switching. But it's fictional. So we coded every single part of speech transition, so from one word to the next, as either a switch or a stay, essentially, switch or no stay. The predictor variables would be the POS of the previous token, the language of the previous token, and then which corpus it comes from. Here's again the results of our logistic regression, whether you're switching or not switching. You can see that after punctuation, this is not surprising, you can switch anywhere after punctuation. So you can change languages at phrasal boundaries or at the end of sentences without a problem. Pronouns, Juana will be happy to see, if she's in here somewhere. Pronouns, it's pretty yucky to switch after a pronoun across all these corpora, no matter what they're like. The strange thing was that determiners, though, are right here in the middle at the even odds. Anything that crosses that line is even odds. It neither favors or disfavors. Well, what's going on with this? You shouldn't be switching after determiners. So, well, what do we find from just these trends? We know that code switching is more likely in Killer Chronicas than in the others. It's actually 11 times more likely to occur after punctuation than it is, I think, after verbs, which is our reference point. And it's 84% less likely to occur after pronouns. It doesn't mean that it doesn't occur after pronouns, but that it's very unlikely to do so. But this business with the determiner flies in the face of things like the functional head constraint. We shouldn't be switching after determiners, even though we know that sometimes we do. Okay. So we wondered, well, maybe switches after determiners are borrowings, and this is what Bullock Toribio and Ed Rubin had argued that this kind of juncture should sort of be excluded because nouns are frequently just borrowed. So if nouns are borrowed, then spans after determiner should be short because you're just borrowing a single noun, right? So we can use the span information that we have to see if this is the case across these corpora. So we fit a linear regression. So how long is the span after each part of speech, okay? And what you can see here, I took punctuation out because if you take punctuation allows gigantic spans after it. You can switch into the next language. But what you can see here is that the determiner right there, the spans after determiner are really, really short. It looks like spans after number are really short too, but that's only because there's only about 3 numbers in here. So you can probably ignore that. So in fact, in each of these corpora, regardless of how switchy they are, the spans after the determiner are significantly shorter than all the other spans. So that means that it is likely that these might be more borrowings than like actual code switches. So we thought, well, maybe we also should explore the effect of the language of the determiner because it's well known that that can cause an asymmetric effect. So we looked at the interaction plot, and here you've got, if the language of the determiner is English, here it is right there, you're unlikely to switch into Spanish. But notice that if the language of the determiner is Spanish, it's okay to switch into English. Okay? Across these 3 different corpora, even if English is really the main language of the document. So we can do a few more syntactic things. The functional head constraint would also say you're not supposed to be able to switch between verbs. And our POS tag from Google isn't very sophisticated, so there's no auxiliary tag. But we can look at the verb-verb bigram transitions, and you can see in red, this is Killer Chronica's S7 and M40. You can see in red that we hardly ever switch between verbs. Okay? So it looks like you don't switch after auxiliaries or modal verbs either, as we would suspect. So all we've done here is to use our language spans and a simple, really simple stripped-down part-of-speech tag. So we can find that most code switching is phrasal or intersentential. You're unlikely to switch after pronouns or auxiliaries. There's asymmetry after determiners where it's okay to switch as long as you're switching from a Spanish determiner into English. And the language of so I already said that. So despite these weird switching profiles of these Spanish-English texts, one highly mixed, the other 2 highly unbalanced toward English in one sense and for Spanish in the other corpus, they all follow the same syntactic constraints. So we can do this. We did this easily. We did this the analysis in like 10 minutes because everything's nicely coded. So the conclusions for our talk is that our metrics are language independent and anonymous. They're very simple metrics. They're not perfect. We're still working on them. The math is a little bit weird, and you might have noticed there should be some collinearity here and there. We're taking care of all those things. But if these metrics are language independent and anonymous, then this should lift the blockade on the IRB and sharing. So there's no reason people can't share tagged data with us. We just need the annotations. We don't need the language. And so pooling resources from different languages gives us more information than if we're working with only one data set. Arguably, it might be more valuable to have 300 small data sets than one large one of code switching. So what we're doing right now is we're revising and scaling our metrics. Particularly memory doesn't get as much in natural language. We are creating our code. We have our code already available in GitHub, so if you want to try running these metrics or tagging your data, you can do so. But we're going to make it look nicer through a Jupyter notebook or some such thing. And then we're working on automatically generating code switching. We're going to make our own code switching since it's hard to find actual code switching out there. So we want to just thank some international colleagues. We're not the only ones out here interested in this. We have friends from Microsoft Bangalore. This is a huge problem in India because nobody doesn't switch languages in India. And so these guys are charged with creating, what's the system? What's the Microsoft personal assistant, digital assistant? Alexa. Yeah. Was that right? Cortana. So the Indian Cortana is going to have to understand oral code switching. So they're working on this project too. And that's us, and that's our lab, and those are all the people that are helping us. So thanks to our collaborators, Wally Guzman, Jacqueline Toribio, Joe Rickard, Vivek Sharath, and Elizabeth Green. Most of them are undergraduates, so we're pretty happy working with them. Thanks.